how does Solarpunk translate into tangible design principles? What our cities and landscapes might look like if Solarpunk architects had free reign?
I'm going to quote my friends at the firm, my friends and colleagues at the firm Rival Strategy, who used to teach at the RCA, and say that for them, architecture is over. What comes next is spatial strategy.
What does that mean?
That what we are primarily engaged in is that we need to rethink our relationship, not just with the environment, as we've been talking about, but with the landscape itself. And that architecture is just one of the disciplines that has the ability to impose or to produce some kind of imposition in the long term on a particular landscape. And that actually we should be thinking that buildings themselves are nestled within a landscape, and therefore that landscape has certain qualities and so on and so forth, and that actually that even the imposition of a building, what comes first is the spatial strategy around the building and how it sits within its environment.
Right.
I think we can finally dispense with kind of the modernism of imposing one's will on the landscape and move on from that. So let's say that I use the term land as platform a lot to describe what I'm talking about, in that there are certain activities that need to run or need to happen within a landscape. One of those activities, of course, is a building, but there are also the considerations of water and foliage and tree cover and soil regeneration, and also economic activities that might need to happen in these regions. And for me, it feels, or it seems to me, that the two main things that I think people who are listening to this show should know about, one of them is permaculture in general, and the idea of its core ideas around water management and as a design strategy for regeneration of landscapes. And the other one is keyline design, which is used by almost all of the really influential regenerative landscape. I mean, they're not landscape architects, really. They're, gardening on a grand scale. But people like Darren Doherty and so on and so forth use keyline design as a design principle or a strategy for imposing their decisions upon a landscape. Would you like me to explain keyline design?
Yes, please. I mean, both permaculture and keyline design, just in brief summary.
Yes. So permaculture began in the 1970s in Australia with Bill Mollison, David Holmgren, and they were, I suppose, refugees from the hippie movement in some way, and were concerned around, were concerned with the concerns of the 1970s, peak oil, so on and so forth. And what emerged from their work is permaculture, as in like permanent culture or permanent agriculture, as a way of thinking about landscape in a more long-term way. So privileging perennial crops over annual crops, designing systems of water in the landscape and so on and so forth, which allow for the rehydration of the landscape to make it more resilient during drought and so on. There are many techniques for permaculture depending on the environment that you're in, but it's a design science, as they call it, an open-ended design science. And then on the other side of that is keyline design, which is also Australian, by P.A. Yeomans. And it is basically a method of laying out or understanding landscape that makes it useful for the large-scale rehydration of landscape, but in contrast to the techniques that are used in permaculture, keyline design allows one to design a landscape around economic activity, and so on and so forth. So it basically involves holding water as high up in the landscape as possible with ponds, and then having parallel contour lines that make sense within the landscape to allow you to move water from the valleys out to the ridges. Not downhill, but slightly downhill out to the ridges, because rehydrating ridges is something that doesn't happen in nature, obviously. But farmers use it, and it's used in agroecology and silvopasture and all sorts of different programs of regeneration. And it's a very useful way of thinking about a landscape in depth, because it allows you to decide where you're going to put fences all the way up to changing the hydrology of the landscape by digging ponds and so on and so forth, which is a 10,000-year imposition,
A few things have happened that have really dramatically changed the potential for application. That this container has become more robust and more real world by virtue of what's happening in the real world. One of them was the price of solar power. Now, I remember, and I was a consultant back in the day, where putting a solar panel on a building was was a luxury because it was so expensive. Today, the prices have dropped dramatically, and it's possible to imagine that future that I see in some of these images that you talk about, where solar is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it has a lot to do with the way the economics has shifted and changing, therefore, the demand for these things. Just throwing this out there as a point of discussion, because it's gone from being a literary, artistic movement to one where there are tangible, prescriptive ideas there. It's and the demand for these ideas has changed while everybody was talking about it. The world changed and caught up with it, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah, I think it changes the role of Solarpunk in some sense, because it does feel like these ideas are now more tangible, as you were saying. Like the cost of solar has continued to drop. Yes, the price is dropping, but that future isn't here yet. It still isn't here. And what do we do? What do we need to do to convince people that this is what it's going to be like? And also, the question is how do we build coalitions of people for lobbying the existing power structure, capital P power, rather than electricity power, to change the nature of our societies? Because solar everywhere is a completely different is a completely different technical setup in terms of a system to the way that we run things today. The late mayor of Jackson, Chokwe Lumumba, said that dealing in infrastructure is a means for self-determination, basically, and that the kind of future that Solarpunk imagines, and the one that may be coming, is one where individuals have far more agency around infrastructure than we have previously had in the past. In part, this is great for the developing world, because it means they can skip the costly grids and so on and so forth, and have all these smart grids and batteries in the home. But from the point of view of here in the West, I mean, at least in the UK where I am, there is a huge failure of the imagination around discussions around net zero and how much it's going to cost and so on and so forth. And it's going to cost a lot, but it's something that we need to do as a society. And I hope that Solarpunk can in some way play a part in building that coalition of the willing to actually do the things that we need to do to break from the past.
Coalition of the willing. I love that phrase.